I'm James Rosone.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Rigged. Book 1 of the Falling Empires series. Written by James Rosone and Miranda Watson. Narrated by B.J. Harrison. The Thucydides Trap. It was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. Thucydides. According to Graham Allison's analysis in Foreign Policy, June 9, 2017, over the past 500 years, there have been 16 cases in which a rising power threatened to displace a ruling one, and in 12 of those cases, the result was war. As China continues to gain power economically and militarily, is it only a matter of time before a showdown erupts? Those who live in the United States would like to believe that their nation's status as a superpower is safe. But is it really? This book began as an analysis of what could really happen if America fell headfirst into the Thucydides trap. We hope it never becomes a reality. Prologue. July 2018. Kulm Hotel, St. Moritz, Switzerland. The mountain air was crisp and cool as the sun crept closer to the edge of the alpine crest line that encompassed the tiny Swiss village of St. Moritz. The scene was picturesque. The peaks were covered in lush greens and dotted with wildflowers. The occasional grazing cows and sheep sauntered along, lazily eating to their heart's content. Johann, the German foreign minister, couldn't help but feel conflict between the beauty of his surroundings and the severity of the situation at hand. The sommelier refilled the wine glasses at the table, then asked, "Can I get you gentlemen anything else?" As he spoke, he lifted the now empty bottle of 2014 Gantenbein Pinot Noir. The 600 € bottle of wine was Johann Baer's local favorite when he visited St. Moritz. "Nein, vielen Dank," Johann said as he dismissed the man for the time being. Returning his gaze to the men seated around the table in the private dining room, Johann leaned forward. In a hushed tone, he asked, "What are we going to do about these trade tariffs the Americans continue to impose?" Johann was incredibly concerned by the sudden changes that had been made. The global trade policies were rocking Europe and Asia. More importantly, they were costing him and his colleagues an immense fortune. Erik Jahn, the manager of the Norway Sovereign Wealth Fund, shook his head in disgust. "What can we do?" he replied. "We have to adjust to the new normal, at least until a new president is elected." Peng An, the CEO of China Investment Corporation, lifted his glass of wine to his lips, taking a few sips as he contemplated the question. He seemed lost in thought as his gaze trailed off toward the sprawling village below the hotel, where the lights were just beginning to twinkle as the sun finished its retreat behind the mountains. Finally, he placed his half-empty glass down on the table. Looking at his compatriots, he announced, "We have two choices. We either sit back and wait out this American president, or we look to replace him with someone of our choosing that sees the world as we see it." Grunting at the implication, Roberto Lamy, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, retorted, "It's not that simple, Pang. You don't get to pick who will be the American candidates for president. They have a primary process where they are selected. Roberto is partially right, Johann acknowledged. We cannot pick their candidates for them. We can, however, whittle down the options they have to choose from. He finished off his glass of wine, then waved for the sommelier to come refill his drink. Peng shook his head in frustration. This is 1930 all over again. All those protectionist trade policies will cause another Great Depression, he said. More like 1933, retorted Johann, thinking of the rise of the Nazis in Germany. Swatting the comment down with a literal shake of his hand, Peng responded, President Sachs may be a petulant bully, but he's no Hitler, Johann. Be sensible, won't you? Stinging from the rebuke, Johann replied, I'm sorry, you're right. My concern is that his nationalist tendencies are leading the world closer to another great clash. We have to figure out a way to stop him before the economic damage he's inflicting becomes irreversible. He turned to look at Roberto. There must be more the WTO can do, he pleaded. Roberto sighed. Even if a nation brings a claim against the U.S. to the WTO, we have little we can do to make the Americans cooperate. If their president and his political backers are unwilling to honor the WTO rules or judgments, what can we do? It's not like we have a standing army. Furthermore, the Americans have a $20 trillion economy. It's not like they need a trade with Greece or Italy for their economic survival. Shaking his head in resignation, he added, They're already proving they can survive and grow outside of their current trade arrangements with China, as I'm sure Peng here can attest. Peng appeared visibly frustrated, with his nostrils flaring and his face slightly flushed. Up to this point, China had been able to use its considerable economic weight against the U.S., forcing their companies to hand over intellectual property rights and trade secrets if they wanted to do business in China. However, that practice had abruptly changed when the Sachs administration had begun to impose a series of tough tariffs on products being produced in China and shipped to the U.S. Downing the rest of his wine, Peng added, The time for change is coming soon, gentlemen. We have little more than 2 years until their next presidential election. I suggest we use that time wisely. I think it's time you get in touch with Lance Solomon from Goldman Sachs, said Eric, directing his comment at Johann. You know that he knows the American side of this better than we do. We will need his connections to make this work. Chapter 1. Beginnings of Mischief. Veles, Macedonia. Wen watched Defina's fingers move rapidly across the keyboard of her laptop as she finished compressing the terabytes of data she had just stolen and dumped them onto the secured site he had provided. With her immediate work completed, she turned her attention back to him. She ran her fingers across his bare chest. It's complete. All the information you asked for is there, she said with a coy smile. Now pay me the other half of my money. You made sure to leave enough breadcrumbs that will lead them back to KHS? Wen Zhenyu asked. The fingers of his left hand gently walked up her spine. The feeling of his fingers against the bare skin of her back caused goosebumps to appear on her arms as she seemed to be excited by his touch. Tilting her head slightly, she answered, Of course. Anyone looking to trace the intrusion will be led right to the Kosovo hackers' security. I made it look like I was one of their Albanian hackers. No one will be able to trace it back to me personally. Smiling at the response, Wen asked, Does anyone else know you worked on this project with me? His hand now massaged the tops of her shoulders as he moved his other hand over to provide a nice, deep tissue massage. She moaned softly as he worked out a kink in her neck. No, I didn't tell anyone I was working on this project. As far as my friends know, I'm still running my fake news website. I might add that website pays pretty well, too, Defina asserted. She lifted her chin up, fully relaxing her shoulder muscles. "Excellent," Wen replied. He moved his right hand up to her face, and before she even knew it was happening, he snapped her neck, momentarily holding her now limp body in his arms. He gently laid her down on the bed they had been sitting on and folded her laptop up, placing it in his backpack. With his work done and his loose ends tied up, it was time for Wen to head back to his office in Skopje and sift through the data she had scooped up for him. An hour later, Wen walked into his office on the second floor of the Silk Road Bank in central Skopje. His secretary greeted him. "You have a call from a client that needs to speak with you about a business loan, and your 3 o'clock with that local businessman is still on," she announced, handing him a note. "Thank you," Wen replied with a smile. Before he closed his door, he leaned back out into the hall and said, "Please make sure I'm not disturbed until my 3 o'clock meeting shows up." Once inside his office, Wen handled the necessary emails to the home office in Bar, Switzerland, just south of Zurich. That would appease his corporate masters. He'd become very adept at completing a large amount of work in a very short amount of time, something that had been drilled into him since his days in the state-run orphanage in his homeland of China. With the immediate needs of his day job handled, Wen logged on to a World of Warcraft MMO forum and perused the various threads until he found the World's End Tavern, roleplay and fan fiction page, and clicked on it. Once in, he scrolled through until he found the specific thread he was looking for. He typed in a coded message to his compatriots along with half of the URL to the server where the terabytes of stolen data had been placed. Wen then opened a new window and found his way to a forum page of the video game World of Tanks. He clicked on a page for off-topic questions and found his desired thread. He dropped the rest of the URL needed to find the server with the data his minders had tasked him with acquiring. With his cloak and dagger work done, he transitioned back to the mundane paperwork associated with his upcoming meeting with a small business owner looking to obtain a loan to purchase a second petrol station. It usually took him a moment to refocus his mind back to the slow grind after the excitement and adrenaline of his passion, spycraft for his only true parent, China. He read through the reports again. The highway linking Thessaloniki, Greece to Belgrade, Serbia was nearly complete, and the amount of truck and other vehicle traffic moving along the E75 highway through Kumanovo was about to increase substantially. This loan applicant was hoping to capitalize on the increased truck traffic by building a second petrol station along the busy route. Wen reviewed the reviews of the man's existing petrol station and the estimates of the potential revenues at the second location. He didn't see a reason why his bank wouldn't approve the loan. It was a solid business investment. Chapter 2. Electronic Misbehavior. September 2018, Tampa, Florida. It was a balmy 82 degrees, and the sun wasn't even up yet. Seth rounded the corner on his way back to Lagoda Avenue. He'd reached the home stretch of his daily 3-mile run. Seeing that he was less than 300 meters from home, Seth quickened his stride until he was in a full-out sprint for the remainder of his run. His feet pounded heavily on the pavement, especially considering the added 80 pounds of his run-fast max-weighted vest. With his heart pounding like a drum as he ran past his house, he immediately slowed down until he came to a walking pace. He kept walking for another 100 meters before turning around to head back home. Seth then completed his usual series of breathing exercises to regain control of his racing heart and panting breath. Running with this weighted vest is a real killer, he thought, restraining himself from moaning audibly. Seth opened his garage door, took the vest off and placed it on a specially designed hanger that could hold its weight, and hung it on a hook he'd drilled into one of the wall studs a month ago, when he'd started running with it. One of the senior NCOs at work had told him that if he wanted a great way to improve his running endurance without increasing his running distance, he should try running with a heavily weighted run vest. It would improve not just his run times, but also his endurance. While he'd found that to be true, Seth also realized that the weight of the vest was already starting to take its toll on his knees and sore back. He went through the side door into the house and saw his wife, Dana, frying up a skillet of duck bacon and a sort of omelet hash thing that had eggs, onions, mushrooms, and green peppers in it. The aroma was incredible. Dana raised an eyebrow at her sweaty husband. Then she winked at him as she said, "Breakfast will be ready in 10 minutes if you want to grab a quick shower." He kissed her on the cheek as she stood next to the stove. She smiled and placed another strip of the specialty bacon on the iron skillet. As Seth walked back to their bedroom, he heard the kids starting to stir. They were sticking to their normal routines, and this seemed like any other morning in the Mitchell household. He walked into the bathroom to get a shower. As was his habit, Seth switched on the Fox Business News app on his Galaxy Note and selected the live reporting option. He turned the volume up and placed his phone on the counter next to the shower before hopping into the steaming water. As he lathered up, the monotony of the broadcast suddenly changed as the anchor broke in with a special news announcement. Breaking news. Google announces a major privacy breach as more than 110 million Gmail account logins and passwords were compromised. No word on who was responsible for the hack, although Google executives are urging people with a Gmail account to change their passwords. I'll have to look into this more when I get to work, Seth thought. He wondered if the guys in the fusion cell already had a lead on who was involved. He finished his shower and customary hygiene routine, then got dressed. Looking in the mirror, he gave his uniform a quick once-over. His patches were all in the right places, and no errant threads were present along the seams, which would have required immediate attention. Ever the soldier, it was important to him that his uniform look professional. He never knew who he might end up briefing or speaking with throughout the day. He walked into the kitchen and heard their precocious 8-year-old ask, "Mom, can you drop us off at school today?" "What's wrong with the bus?" inquired Dana as she placed some of the skillet creation on her daughter's plate. She then placed some on a plate for Seth, along with 3 pieces of bacon, and passed him a bottle of water mixed with his special concoction of electrolytes to help him recharge quickly from his morning run. Plopping down next to his daughter, Seth prodded, "Why do you want Mommy to take you to school, Lily?" She crinkled her face at the question. "I don't want to ride the bus anymore," she declared. "The other girls in my class all have their parents drop them off at school, or they have a driver. I want a driver to take me to school, just like them." Trying not to laugh at her reply, Seth held up a hand to let his wife know he had this. "Lily, my little princess," he began, "you have a very special driver that picks you up every day at the bus stop and takes you to school. His name is Mr. Ben. You know Ben. He's a great guy. You said he even reminds you of Grandpa. What's wrong with Ben?" "Nothing's wrong with Mr. Ben. I just want to be like the other girls in my class that live here. They all have rich parents or drivers that take them to school." She huffed. She was clearly unhappy that her parents were not seeing how the daily bus ride was impeding her acceptance by the other girls in her class. Dana broke into the conversation. "Lily, it doesn't matter what these kids think of how you get to school. It's just a bus ride. What matters is how well you do in school, not what vehicle you're dropped off in. What have I told you about money?" she asked. Lily's shoulders sank. She let out a deep breath, then pouted a bit as she answered, "Money doesn't mean happiness. I should be happy with what I have and not desire what others have." Patting her on the shoulder, Seth smiled and encouragingly said, "That's my girl." Dana slid past him to get to her own chair, and as she did, she whispered in his ear, I told you living here was going to spoil the kids. When they'd first moved to Tampa at the end of the last school year, she had wanted them to live in South Tampa, not the wealthier neighborhood on Davis Island. "I'm not spoiled," shot back their daughter, who had overheard her mom's comment. "Eat your breakfast. It's almost time to leave for the bus," Seth answered, knowing better than to contradict his wife in front of his daughter. Sulking, Lily hurried as she finished off her eggs and grabbed one of the pieces of bacon. Then she got her stuff ready to head to the bus with her brother. Once she was out of the kitchen, Seth said, "Come on, Dana. You have to admit this place is so much better than our place back in McLean." The kind of home they could afford in the D.C. area of Virginia had been much smaller and had a lot fewer bells and whistles. Besides, your investment advisor said we needed to reinvest the money we made from selling that house back into a new home, or we'd get hit with a big capital gains tax at the end of the year. Lily reappeared. Seth kissed his daughter's head before she headed off to the bus stop down at the end of their road. When she had left, Dana resumed their conversation. "Yeah, but we didn't have to sink it into buying such a huge and overly expensive place in the middle of Tampa Bay. You know, if a hurricane comes through here, we're in a mandatory evacuation zone. This entire place could be wiped out from a storm surge. Did you think about that, Mr. Hotshot?" she asked coyly. She flipped on the morning news and put Lily's plate and glass in the dishwasher after grabbing a few bites of her own breakfast. This place was a steal at the price they had it listed," Seth insisted. "Besides, what was it you were telling me about in that book you read, Framework for Understanding Poverty? Something about how you needed to place yourself in a different socioeconomic circle if you want to move from one social tier to another? Living on Davis Island will do that for us and our kids. I thought you'd be happy that I'm taking what that book says seriously." During the last 3 years, Seth had been stationed in Northern Virginia, on loan from the DoD to the agency. He had been gone almost continuously on short TDY rotations, which had not given him a lot of time with his family. It had really hurt his relationship with his kids, since they were still little, and his work had unfortunately been turning him into an absentee father. That was a major reason he'd opted to make this his last tour in the Army and retire. Dana sighed as she turned to look at her husband. "I know," she answered. "And I am glad that you're paying attention to the book I had you read. I really am. I just don't want our kids to grow up thinking that because we live in a rich neighborhood, we're somehow rich. We just got lucky when we bought our home in McLean and sold it at the right time." Dana's brother was a realtor in the Northern Virginia suburbs and had found them a real fixer-upper in need of a new owner. Seth had been dead set against buying it, since he'd known he wouldn't have the time to fix it up. But Dana had seen the opportunity to turn the dilapidated property into a real gem and set to work herself. 18 months and nearly $60,000 later, they had turned the house into the envy of the neighborhood. And when they'd had to move, they had turned the $540,000 home into a $1 million sale, netting them a solid profit. During one of Seth's many TDY deployments, one of the CIA analysts he'd worked with had told him he should invest heavily in several companies that were doing some innovative work in AI. He even got in on an angel investor round with one of the agency tech guys that had started his own firm after retiring from the agency. Those investments had ended up making Seth a lot of money in a very short amount of time. The better Seth's stock portfolio performed, the more secure he felt about his decision to retire from the Army after this last stint was done. Seth glanced at the news and decided it was time to change the subject. "Did you hear about the Google hack?" he asked. Dana nodded as she finished off her breakfast. "Yeah. I'm sure this will be a big deal when I get to work. You know, we've been poaching a lot of their top tech people to work on our artificial intelligence trading platform." You were telling me about that the other day. You'll have to tell me more about that trading platform one of these days, he answered. Seth, you know I can't do that, she shot back with a mischievous grin. Seth surmised that she might be plied into being more forthright later that evening with a bottle of Coup de Foudre Cabernet Sauvignon, her favorite wine. I'll be sure to grab a bottle of Coup on my way home from work this afternoon then, he said with a wink and a nod. How come I end up telling you all about the secret programs I work on, and you never share any of yours? I still don't know half of what you worked on while we were in McLean, she responded. Seth sighed. Dana had been a trooper through most of his time in the Army, but the secrecy of his last assignment had really taken a toll on her. She'd never fully known how long he'd be gone, or when he might have to leave. That had really been hard on her, especially while managing their little ones. He was still paying the price for the birthdays and holidays he'd missed in their formative years. One of these days, babe, I'll tell you all about it. For right now, we just have to leave it at that. Speaking of work, I need to get going, or I'm going to be late. Seth grabbed his beret and keys, then gave his wife a short kiss on the lips before adding, I'll see you tonight. 20 minutes later, Major Seth Mitchell pulled up to the Bayshore entrance of MacDill Air Force Base. The Air Force Security Forces airman waved his hand for him to pull forward. Seth quickly handed the senior airman his CAC card, making sure to look up at the young man as he held the card up and compared the face in the picture with Seth's. The airman snapped a crisp salute and then handed his CAC card back to him. Then he motioned for him to enter the base. Seth placed his CAC back into his lanyard, along with his SOCOM security access badge, and gave his Chevy Z71 crew cab a bit of gas as he moved along Bayshore Boulevard until he came to the split in the road. He guided the truck to the right onto Tampa Point Boulevard, which would lead him to the next entry control point for U.S. Special Operations Command. At this time of day, the sun had finally risen enough that it had moved above the enormous phosphate mound that was directly across the bay at the Riverview Mosaic plant. As was usual for this time of the morning, Seth saw small clusters of military members along the rubberized running path that ran the eastern perimeter of the base, participating in their morning individual and group physical training exercises. When he arrived at the parking garage, Seth found a spot on the second floor. He grabbed the small cooler that contained the healthy lunch his wife had prepared for him and headed off to what he was sure would be a busy day. When he got to the northeast entrance, he turned his smartphone to silent and locked it in one of the many phone boxes outside the side entrance. No one was allowed to bring a phone or any electronic device into the building, so there were several walls of small metal boxes near the entrance to allow people who worked in the building a safe place to lock up their electronics so they could still access them without having to walk all the way back to their cars. As soon as he entered the ops center, Seth was flagged down by one of the junior captains. "Good morning, Major Mitchell. The boss said he wanted to see you as soon as you were in." Nodding at the warning, Seth replied, "Thanks for the heads up, Joel. I'll head over there now. First things first, though. I need my caffeine," he thought. He was grateful this ketogenic diet his wife had him trying didn't mean he had to give up coffee. Sacrificing his morning Red Bull had almost been a deal-breaker. A moment later, Seth had his coffee in hand and made his way over to his boss's office. He knocked on the doorframe, letting Colonel Pete Jennings know he was there. His boss was on the phone but quickly waved him in and pointed to the empty seat opposite his desk.
"Yes, sir, we'll get on it right away. No, sir, we should have something for you hopefully by mid-afternoon. Yes, sir. We'll brief you as soon as we know something."
Hanging up the phone, Colonel Jennings looked like a man on fire, and it was only 0700 hours.
"You still in tight with your former colleagues in McLean?" Jennings asked.
Seth nodded as he took a sip of coffee. Yeah, I still have some contacts up there, though as you know, most of my contacts are probably no better than our reach back to JSOC, he replied. Maybe so. But try them anyway, Jennings said. This Google hack is apparently a bigger deal than what's being reported in the media. That was the commander on the phone. He said there's a COCOM secure video teleconference at 1300 hours to go over the specifics, but he wants to know as much as possible before the SVTC happens. So a few emails got hacked. This kind of crap's been going on for years. Why is this any different? Seth said casually. Colonel Jennings snorted. Because it's not every day the president's entire cabinet-secured email system is hacked. The president's own account was compromised. That's why. Seth's left eyebrow rose cautiously. He put his coffee cup down on the edge of his boss's desk. Yeah, I suppose this is a new turn of events. On the news, it sounded like this was limited to Google's Gmail system. How did the hackers break into the White House's system? Do we have any clues as to who is responsible for this yet? Jennings shook his head. I'm sure the NSA or Cyber Command has an idea. What the general wants to know is not just who is responsible, but if possible, where they're located and what potential assets we have nearby. Seth nodded and picked his coffee cup back up. Okay, I see what you're looking for. I'll make a few calls, see what I might be able to dig up, and get back to you shortly. Seth headed back to his cubicle, along the outer wall of the room. His group, the J2X, was responsible for providing intelligence and communications support to a variety of clandestine operations that SOCOM had running all over the world. Seth's more exact job description had to do with the cyber and sensitive site exploitation side of things. Given that he had just spent the last 3 years on loan to the CIA's Special Activities Division, he had a plethora of experience hunting down hackers and leveraging data to create real-world capture missions. The U.S. government had recently taken a much more hands-on approach to the massive increase in cyber attacks across the country, and that gave Seth a lot more power. A few hours later, Seth had finished making more than a dozen phone calls from his Rolodex, and he had finally found the information he was looking for. The initial traces of the hack were pointing to an Albanian hacker group that largely operated out of Kosovo, Albania, and Macedonia. While their electronic fingerprints were all over the Gmail hack, the hacker tools used to gain entry into the White House systems had the fingerprints of China. They had narrowed it down to China's Strategic Support Force, and more specifically, the shadowy People's Liberation Army Unit 61398, their elite cyber hacking unit, which had previously been identified by both Mandiant and FireEye as one of the leading global perpetrators of cyber hacking. Knowing who had carried out the attack was important, but figuring out specifically what the hackers were after was probably even more critical. Thus far, the forensic analysts involved had not been able to successfully weed through the meaningless rabbit trails of information that the hackers had left to obscure their true intentions. Seth had been given a secured agency port and access to the terabytes of data the hackers had access to, so he cleared his mind and began to think logically about what the hackers could have been after. What would be so valuable that the Chinese would be willing to take the political hit this will cause? He wondered. Going after the president and his cabinet members directly was definitely a gutsy move. Shanghai, China. Zhou Gang, the head of the Bank of China, looked at the reports on the table in front of him, both impressed that the intelligence service had actually been able to acquire them, and a bit concerned at the lengths they'd taken to get them. While he should have been shocked by their contents, or at least surprised, he had come to expect the unexpected when dealing with the American president. Jonathan Sachs, the 45th American president, had proven to be an unpredictable and often combustible man to have to deal with. While Zhou respected the man's tenacity and desire to do what was in the best interest of his own country, often what was in the best interest of America ran counter to China's own designs for the future. The realization of Greater China was becoming greatly imperiled by this upstart. Lying before him on the table was an astute economic case being made by several senior Sachs administration officials for why the U.S. government should move forward with labeling China a currency manipulator after the collapse of the most recent round of trade talks. Up until that point, Zhou's policy of threatening a trade war at the mention of such an action had immediately caused the American presidents to back down. However, he could see from the information before him that President Sachs was not going to be intimidated by that tactic. In fact, he was pushing to call their bluff and create an actual trade war. Zhou knew that, despite his previous declarations of China's strength and willpower, a trade war would devastate his country's economy. He also had the sneaking suspicion that if tens of millions of people lost their jobs, the president's regime would not survive. If he wanted to hold on to the power he had so carefully worked to obtain, Zhou couldn't allow the growing middle class of his nation to become grossly discontent. President Sachs may have his faults, but he does seem to have a decent idea of just how tenuous our position is, Zhou thought. If the Americans were really going to move forward with labeling the People's Republic of China a currency manipulator and impose even stiffer tariffs on them, then more drastic measures would need to be taken. Zhou vowed to rapidly advance the 2049 plans that had been drafted up. China couldn't wait 31 more years to dethrone America as the dominant superpower. The timeline was going to have to be accelerated. An aide walked up to Zhou, disturbing his thoughts. The man leaned down and quietly whispered, "Sir, the president should be arriving momentarily." Zhou looked up and nodded. He could feel his heart begin to race. Chen was well known to be hot-headed and volatile. He certainly hadn't been kind to those who had displeased him in the past. Punishment by Chen usually involved far more than harsh words. The stakes were incredibly high. Zhou took a deep breath and steeled his nerves. Today he should be in Chen's good graces, and he couldn't allow himself to display any weakness before his leader. He quickly gathered the reports before him into two separate piles, one containing the American president's communications, and the other the data collected from the cabinet members. Several security members walked into Zhou's office and began hastily roving about the room, ensuring it was secured. After a few moments, one of them lifted his hand to his mouth and whispered something to his fellow compatriots. A minute later, the leader of China walked in and headed right for Zhou. The head of the Bank of China quickly moved around his desk to greet his leader. The two bowed slightly, as was their custom, and then exchanged a few pleasantries before they sat down to discuss the treasure trove of information they had just acquired. A beautiful woman walked in, carrying a tray with an ornate porcelain tea set. She quickly fixed them a cup of tea before leaving the pot and tray on the coffee table nearby, in case either of them wanted more tea during their meeting. President Chen eagerly sipped his tea for a moment, breathing deeply, as if he were having a spiritual experience. Then he set his teacup down and looked at Zhou with an expression that seemed to pierce his very soul.
China is under an enormous amount of global scrutiny and pressure as a result of this most recent cyber attack against the White House's communication system, he began. Please tell me you were able to obtain the information you were looking for. This attack had better not have turned up nothing.
Zhou took a deep breath. If he had been wrong about the American government's economic intentions, this intrusion would have unnecessarily cost China a lot of political clout. However, his assumptions had not been wrong. If anything, the intelligence before him showed that the situation was much more dire than previously predicted. Zhou confidently returned his leader's stare. "Mr. President, I had warned that if we continued to push President Sachs too hard, if we didn't make some economic concessions, he would use the power of his economy against us. Our hacker team was able to uncover a series of executive orders that Sachs plans to enact after their midterm elections on November 6th. Orders that will go into effect almost immediately." The president took another sip of the tea before him, almost as if he were absorbing the information along with the hot beverage he was imbibing.
"So what you're saying is the American president is going to follow through on his threat of a trade war,"
Chen said. Zhou shook his head. "No, Mr. President. He's not just going to move forward with a trade war. He's essentially declaring economic war on China," he declared. "When the American Treasury Department officially labels us a currency manipulator, they're going to hit all of our exports with a 45% tariff. It's going to effectively cripple our economy."
"So, what's our recourse?"
Chen asked. "Sir, I had thought we could get around the tariffs by simply lowering the value of our currency against the dollar, thus negating the effects of the tariff. But from reading the drafted executive orders, it would appear the American Treasury Department has already taken that into effect. Essentially, each time I would lower the value of our currency to counter their move, the Americans would raise the tariff by an equal measure." Zhou shook his head in dismay. This was the first time in his life that he was truly at a loss as to what to do next, or how to navigate his country's economy through these turbulent times. Chen leaned forward in his chair.
"Can't we just ride this trade war out with them?" he asked. "I mean, surely this will hurt the American consumer in the short run. There has to be a way we can leverage that financial pain to our gain, right?"
Zhou shook his head again. "No, Mr. President. If these tariffs go into effect and stay in place for more than 6 months, we could see a GDP contraction of more than 6%. If that were to happen, it would result in tens of millions of our people being laid off and thousands of our factories and businesses being forced to shut down. If the trade war lasted more than 12 months, it could completely collapse our economy."
President Chen narrowed his gaze. "It can't be that bad, Zhou," he insisted, clearly becoming angrier by the minute. "Surely we can pick up the export slack by increasing our trade with Europe, the Middle East, and South America."
Zhou tilted his head to one side, considering the outcomes. "Yes, we could offset some of this through increased trade with our other trading partners, but none of our partners consume the sheer volume the Americans do," he finally said. "A $20 trillion economy that consumes more than $650 billion in trade with us couldn't be quickly replaced. To essentially lose access to it would devastate our economy." Zhou leaned forward. "The way I see it, Mr. President, we have 2 options. We can either concede some of these trade positions the Americans are demanding, or we need to make a move that will replace the current American administration, or bring the country to its knees. If they do move forward with these tariffs, we must retaliate with our own," Zhou asserted. "My only concern in doing so is finding other sources we can purchase those products from. For example, we import more than $15 billion in soybeans. Civilian aircraft parts and scrap metals also account for more than $20 billion. These are the areas where we could hit the Americans with tariffs, but while that would hurt them, it would create a shortage in our own markets, unless we already have a pipeline to replace those imports." President Chen was silent as he thought for a moment.
"The Americans have their midterm elections in little more than a month. What direct actions can we take to shift the political power in their government to one that would be more favorable to our way of thinking?" Chen asked.
Zhou smiled. Up to that point, Chen had been hesitant to interfere in American elections. He'd preferred for Russia and other nations to draw that kind of political heat. However, it seemed that he had finally come around to the bank administrator's way of thinking. "I've given this some thought, Mr. President. Now that we know what their intentions are post-election, there's no need to be cautious." He paused for a second as he collected his thoughts. "First, we target the president's strongest trade war supporters. We identify what specific manufacturing and agricultural products are coming from their districts, and we place targeted tariffs on them. This will directly affect those constituents the most, and hopefully they will vote against the Senate or congressional candidates that are supporting the president's hostile trade agenda." Chen nodded at the idea, effectively giving his go-ahead. "Next, we look to start crashing their stock market as they head toward election day, and this will cause the voters to become angry at the party in power and create angst over a continuation of the president's trade war policies. The quickest way for us to cause a short-term stock market crash is to start dumping our treasury holdings. At the same time, we would devalue our own currency through a series of quantitative measures aimed at reducing the impact of the tariffs and the effects of us dumping the American treasuries. Make no mistake, Mr. President, this will hurt China in the short run. But I think we could ride out this type of turmoil easier than we could a protracted trade war with the Americans."
Chen quickly countered. "And what do we do if the president's political party remains in power? We'll have fired the few remaining economic bullets we have, and we still wouldn't have helped our cause by electing a friendlier government."
"That is a risk we'd have to take, Mr. President," Zhou insisted. "In the end, I think the Americans will blink and come to their senses. If they don't, well, then there's always trouble we could stir up in North Korea or the South China Sea. We have other levers of influence and power we can pull." The two of them sipped their tea as they contemplated their options. During the next couple of hours, a plan was hatched to deal with the current American government until the midterm elections. Following the results, they'd re-examine their options and see what more might need to be done to bring the Americans to heel. Tampa, Florida, MacDill Air Force Base, U.S. Special Operations Command. The conference room in the skiff was full that morning. All the department heads were present for this particular brief. Seeing that everyone was already present, the FBI briefer who was slated to lead things off walked to the front of the room. Clearing her throat before she began, Special Agent Leslie Clancy announced, "What I'm about to tell you is classified top secret and not to be openly discussed outside this room," she announced. Everyone nodded. The FBI's Cybercrimes Division was able to link the initial Gmail hack to a relatively small Albanian hacker group called Kosovo Hacker Security, or KHS. The attack originated out of a small town in Macedonia called Veles, which is just south of the capital city of Skopje. This is also the same small town in Macedonia where the brunt of the fake news articles that caused so much chaos during the 2016 election originated. She saw a few looks of concern in the audience, but continued on. The FBI's legal attaché group in Belgrade was able to coordinate a raid on the home of the hacker we believe was responsible, with local law enforcement personnel in Skopje. Unfortunately, when they entered the apartment, they found the hacker deceased. It appears that the woman in question had had her neck broken. What remains unclear is if this particular hacker was also responsible for the cyber attack against the White House communications network. She took a deep breath and let it out. This is obviously an ongoing interagency investigation, but it's going to take some time to figure out who else was involved, what all was stolen, and for what reason. Sitting near the rear of the briefing room, Leslie saw Major Mitchell raise his hand to ask a question. Since Leslie didn't see any hands raised by any of the generals or senior officers at the table, she nodded for Mitchell to proceed. "I have a technical question for you," Seth stated. The colonels and generals turned to face him, waiting expectantly for what he'd say. "You said the initial Gmail hack was carried out by this Albanian hacker group, KHS. I can buy that. But the cyber attack carried out against the White House network was far more complicated an attack than what KHS could have carried out. Specifically, the hacker toolset used to gain entry into the White House system has electronic traces of ATP-1, which we know has direct ties to the Chinese People's Liberation Army Unit 61398. If your office could perhaps share with us specifically what it was the Chinese were looking for in the White House network, we might be able to piece together a better picture of exactly what they're looking to do with the information they stole." Several of the colonels and generals nodded, and then focused their attention back on Leslie, who suddenly became very nervous and fumbled in her response, eventually giving what was essentially a non-answer. The lone CIA LNO jumped in. "I think this is something we could talk about offline, Major," he asserted. Seth nodded, and Leslie breathed a sigh of relief. Seth knew the CIA LNO, George. The two of them had worked together in the past when he'd been on loan to the agency. Once everyone had filtered out of the room, George jokingly poked Seth in the arm. "You kind of put the poor girl on the spot there with your question," he said with a grin. He'd obviously enjoyed watching his interagency counterparts squirm a bit. "I suppose. But the more we've been digging into this case, the more it just doesn't add up," Seth insisted. "I've looked into that Albanian hacker group. They're small and mostly focused on what's going on in the Balkans. They were heavily involved in the fake news business during the last election cycle, but it appears all the people involved were just doing it to create clickbait farms that generated a lot of marketing money. Most people in the region tend to earn maybe $500 a month, and these clickbait farms were earning more than $2,500 a month in advertising revenue. Kind of ingenious when you think about it." George nodded. "Let's head to your office," he said. Seth's office space was inside a secured skiff, so they could continue their sensitive conversation there. The two of them made their way back. Once they entered the skiff, George guided the two of them away from the prying ears of the analysts working in the open desk format of the center room. "Look, Seth, from our perspective, you're right," George admitted. "This whole KHS thing appears to be a smokescreen, designed to send us down a few dozen rabbit holes. I mean, don't get me wrong, the login credentials of 110 million people is pretty valuable on the dark web, but it wasn't the real target of the attack." Seth smiled. "I knew it," he said, slapping his friend on the shoulder. "So fill me in. What was the real target? And can I share this with the boss? The CG's been all over us for answers on this." George pulled a chair next to Seth's cubicle and sat down. He leaned in close so their conversation couldn't be overheard. "Look, this is super classified right now. I'm not even sure how much of this I can tell you." Not wanting to put his friend in a bind, Seth thought about that for a moment. "Perhaps I can ask you some questions and you can just tell me if I'm getting warmer," he offered. George smiled. "I can neither confirm nor deny what you're asking," he said with a wink. Seth nodded. "From what I can tell, the Gmail hack was just a cover for the Chinese to make their real move on the White House staff accounts. But as to what they were after, perhaps they wanted to gain more information about our military technology secrets. We all know how the Chinese like to steal our designs. Leaning in, George said, "You're right on one level. The Gmail hack was a smokescreen to distract us, and it would have worked had the NSA not placed some sophisticated tracking codes in the emails sent between the president and his cabinet members. This was done a little over a year ago, when the president was hell-bent on identifying who was leaking confidential emails between him and his staff secretaries to the media. The codes actually helped us track down a couple of mid-range government employees who are no longer working for the federal government," he said with a wry smile of enjoyment at ending the career of a few bureaucrats. "Seth, what the hackers stole was specific communiques between the president, his senior trade representatives, the Treasury Secretary, and a handful of other senior advisors. The communiques were all related to the recent trade talks with China and potential repercussions the president was considering if the Chinese do not agree to the new trade terms. It appears they also stole a drafted copy of an executive order the president was considering signing following the coming election. It would formally label the Chinese a currency manipulator and direct the Treasury Department to begin slapping a 45% tariff on all Chinese goods coming into the U.S. Seth let out a soft whistle as his mind wrapped itself around the implications of what that would do to the Chinese economy, not to mention the price of common items people bought every day at Walmart and on Amazon. He sighed and shook his head. "Thanks for filling me in, George," he remarked. "So what do we do next? I mean, the election is just a handful of weeks away, and given what you just said, I can't imagine a scenario where the Chinese don't try to use this information to impact the results. What can truly be done to counter it?" George shook his head glumly. "Nothing, really," he said despondently. "The best we can do is continue to work with the tech companies to help them identify the fake news sites and work to get them shut down, or at least banned from their platforms." The two talked for a bit longer, frustrated that neither of their organizations could take a more direct role in stopping this kind of activity. It wasn't like they could knock on the doors of the individuals in these various countries and kindly ask them to cut it out. Until the groups crossed the line from spreading false information to outright manipulation of physical votes, there wasn't a recourse that allowed them to get more involved. Mitrovica, Kosovo. Enar Duka ran down the alley at a breakneck speed, panting as his eyes darted back and forth, looking for a building he could run into. "Stop! Police!" shouted the officer who was pursuing him. Enar didn't turn around to look, but sensing that the man was gaining on him, he increased his pace as he rushed toward the end of the alley. Suddenly, a police cruiser appeared out of nowhere, blocking his exit. Unable to stop his forward momentum, Enar leaped onto the hood of the vehicle and ran up over the top before jumping down the other side. When he landed on the ground, Enar turned to the left and continued to run, trying his best to put as much distance between himself and his pursuers as possible. "Stop! Police!" shouted the officer again. His partner threw their vehicle into reverse and raced after Enar, who ducked into a cafe along the street. Enar shoved his way past several patrons and burst through the door that led to the kitchen, ignoring the surprised cooks who began to yell at him. He found the back exit and swiftly ran through it into a back alleyway. As he continued racing down this narrow road that separated the buildings on either side of the block, Enar felt like his heart was going to explode. He hadn't run this hard since he'd gotten back from Syria 2 months ago. He came around the corner of the alley and turned right, only to be summarily punched in the face. His arms flailed out as he tried to stop himself from falling. When Enar's body thudded on the ground, the police officer was already on top of him. In one swift moment, the officer had grabbed his left arm and was in the process of twisting him over onto his belly so he could place his handcuffs on him. In that moment, Enar knew if he was arrested, he might not ever leave whatever hole the Ministry of Internal Affairs would put him in. As the police struggled to flip him over onto his belly, Anar grabbed the Sig Sauer he had in the front pocket of his coat. In one daring move, he kicked the officer hard with the back of his heel, which momentarily caused the officer to loosen his grip on Anar's other arm. When that happened, he twisted back around, pointing the Sig right at the officer's head. He fired the weapon without hesitation, hitting the man squarely in the center of his forehead. Blood splattered on Anar's face and the front of his jacket as the back of the man's skull exploded outwards. The officer's facial expression registered a brief look of surprise before his body fell limp to the right of Anar. "Don't move!" shouted the man's partner as he rounded the corner, his pistol drawn. Anar sat up and grabbed the body of the now deceased officer to act as a shield. He swiftly fired several shots at the second officer, hitting him with 2 of the bullets and knocking the man to the ground. Throwing the corpse off him, Anar stood up and walked over to the wounded officer. The man grasped at his shoulder, but bright red blood continued to squirt through his fingers with each heartbeat. The man looked up at him, appearing to beg for his life, before Anar raised his pistol and fired again, this time hitting the man in the head. Anar surveyed the scene. People were running every which way to get away from the shooting. Very few people were standing around waiting to see what was going on, which suited him just fine. He ran back into the alleyway and made his way to a friendly mosque on the other side of town. He threw away his jacket, which was covered in blood, and managed to find an old blanket that had been discarded near a dumpster that he could throw over his shirt to help keep him warm, as well as conceal his identity for the time being. When he walked into the mosque, Anar immediately had a sense of peace. This was the one place he felt safe. He removed his shoes and went to the back rooms, where he found the man he was looking for, Luan Rajepi, teaching a small group of followers. Anar waited just long enough to be respectful to the leader before he got his attention and asked to speak with him privately. When he explained the situation and what transpired, Rajepi calmly responded, "Do not worry, my brother. The Islamic State of Kosovo will take care of you." One of Rajepi's students gave Anar some new clothes, and then they moved him out of the city to one of their safe houses. A week later, Anar was told that his brother had vouched for him, and he would embark upon a great mission. The 2 of them would travel to Germany, where they would await further instructions. In the meantime, they would work at a mosque operated by a friend of Rajepi, receiving free room and board in exchange. Anar didn't care what the mission was. If Rajepi could get him out of Kosovo and back into the fight for Islam, he was more than willing to do it. The fact that he'd had the opportunity to fight again with his brother was an added bonus. Chapter 3. Election Shenanigans. November 11th, 2018, Tampa, Florida, Davis Island. Seth stood next to his grill, double-checking the 4 racks of ribs he had been cooking low and slow for several hours. His wife, Dana, had invited several of their neighbors over for a Veterans Day cookout, hoping to build on the new relationships they'd formed over the summer and get to know more of the people living near them. Half a dozen neighbors had RSVP'd, and Seth was determined to impress them with his secret recipe for fall-off-the-bone barbecue ribs. The key to getting the meat so tender was to slow-cook them in a crock pot in apple juice, and then slow-cook them some more, all lathered up with sweet Baby Ray's barbecue sauce. Seth was very excited that his wife wasn't giving him any grief for slacking off on the keto diet for a day. As Seth slathered another layer of sauce on the ribs, one of his neighbors, Jeff McGinnis, walked over to sneak a peek at the meat. When Seth had closed the lid, Jeff handed him a fresh beer. "You look like you could use another refill," he said good-naturedly. Seth smiled and accepted the drink. "Thanks. I think the ribs are nearly done. Maybe another 5 minutes to let this last layer of sauce caramelize a bit more." "Man, those look good," said Jeff, practically licking his lips. "Trust me when I say they taste even better," Seth said, smiling. "It's a bit of a family secret." Seth popped the top of the bottle of beer and took a swig. "So, Jeff, how's work going for you?" he asked. He had really taken a liking to Jeff. He and his wife had come over the day after they'd moved in, bringing some brownies as a housewarming gift to welcome them to the neighborhood.
Oh, you know, the same old, same old. Different day, same station. How about you? You're in the Army. Things must be pretty interesting for you,
Jeff replied. Taking another drink from his beer, Seth answered, It's always changing, Jeff, that's for sure. But I'm at the headquarters level now, not one of the groups, so the ops tempo is certainly more conducive for the family. Seth hadn't really told his new friend a lot about his job, other than that he was in the Army and where he worked. It was better that way.
That's right, you're in the Special Forces, aren't you? Jeff countered. How'd you decide that's what you wanted to do when you grew up?
In a way, I just kind of fell into it, Seth explained. I came from a poor family. There was actually a time in my life when my family was homeless, and we lived in a campground. I knew if I wanted to go to college or make something of myself, I'd either have to get some academic scholarship, be a great athlete, or find some other way to pay for college. Well, I was doing pretty well in school, and by my senior year, I was in all AP classes. Then our school had a career day, and I met an Army recruiter. He told me about the GI Bill and how I could get vocational training in the Army and then use my GI Bill to pay for college when my enlistment was up. Reaching into the cooler nearby, Seth pulled another beer out and handed it to Jeff. At this point, his other neighbor, Albert, had heard part of the story and come over to join them. I hadn't really thought about joining the Army before that, Seth continued. No one in my family had ever been a part of the military. Shoot, my dad was one of those flower power hippies that burned his draft card during the Vietnam War. So it wasn't like my parents had ever told me about that career path.
So why'd you join then, if you were already in AP classes and probably on the road to getting a scholarship?
Inquired Albert as he pulled another beer out of the cooler for himself. Sighing as he remembered back to his high school years, Seth responded, You know, my dad was a real jerk during my high school years. He had a decent job and made a living wage by then. He was a union pipe fitter, working on various construction projects, but he was also a bit of a drunk. He wasn't physical with us kids, but he was nasty to be around when he drank, which was unfortunately most of the time when he wasn't working. I guess at the time the recruiter talked to me, I just wanted out of the house. And while I probably could have gotten some scholarships to pay for school, the Army was a sure bet. Of course, it didn't hurt that the Army was offering a $10,000 signing bonus in addition to the GI Bill at the time either. Jeff laughed at the comment.
Yeah, I think if a recruiter told my 17-year-old self I could get $10,000 to sign up for the Army plus free college, I probably would have joined as well.
Albert laughed and shook his head.
I think my dad would have found some way to null and void my enlistment papers. He was adamant that I'd go into law just like the rest of the family. It looks like going into law worked out pretty well for you, Al, Jeff said with a chuckle. I saw that new boat you bought, he added with a wink.
He took another sip from his beer, then asked Seth,
So that's how you ended up in Special Forces?
Seth sported a crooked smile. Not exactly. When I joined the Army, it was 1997. At that time, we weren't at war, and there wasn't a lot going on in the world. The job the recruiter had told me about, that would earn me the most college credits, had the largest signing bonus, and sounded the coolest to me as a 17-year-old, was a job called Human Intelligence Collector, which is basically an interrogator. They also had a shortage of Chinese linguists, so they sent me to the military's language school in Monterey, California to learn Mandarin. At the time, my recruiter said I'd probably just interview Chinese defectors and asylum seekers, an easy job that would allow me to take college courses at night. Seth shook his head in amusement at his own naivete back then. That recruiter knew exactly what to tell me to get me to sign up. He knew all I wanted was to get a college degree and money to get away from my folks, and this job offered exactly that.
Sounds like the recruiter was pretty good. Would have made a great lawyer, added Albert with a laugh.
Yeah, he probably would have, Seth answered, smiling. In either case, once I finished language school, that's exactly what they had me doing. They sent me to Japan, where I largely worked debriefing Chinese asylum seekers and defectors. The recruiter wasn't totally wrong. That position did give me an opportunity to take college classes on base. Between my military schools and previous AP classes I had taken, I was quickly able to earn a bachelor's degree in Asian studies. He took a sip of beer, his mood suddenly somber. Then 9/11 happened, and everything changed. I went to officer candidate school, and then went on to join Special Forces. Only this time I was an officer instead of enlisted, he said. Before Seth could say anything more, his wife wandered over to the grill. "You guys almost done with those ribs yet? Everyone's getting hungry," Dana said with a wink. A few of the other wives sauntered up with their husbands. Seth shook himself from dark memories, and his countenance changed. "They sure are," he said with a smile. "Let me pull them off the grill, and you can bring them in the house to cut up." He started loading the glistening specimens of meat onto the nearby tray. The crowd that had gathered was almost visibly salivating at the sight of such delicious grub. The kids were slowly roused out of the pool as the moms got them plates with hot dogs, cheeseburgers, and other trimmings. The dads collected at the table near the grill with their plates of ribs, potato salad, coleslaw, and other fixins. The ladies opted to sit inside, where they continued their own conversation. After finishing off a couple of ribs, Seth turned to Albert. "So, you're a lawyer. What kind of law do you practice?" he asked. Using a baby wipe to clean his hands, Albert responded, "Contract law. Pretty boring stuff, really, but it pays well. My dad is getting closer to retirement, so he's looking to have us kids take over the family firm. Both my sister and brother actually practice law as well. Each of us has taken over a specific specialty in the firm, so we can largely handle most cases that could be brought to us." "Wow, that sounds pretty neat to have a family-run business like that," Seth replied. He envied Albert's story, having a close-knit family that he could work with. So much of what Seth did these days was classified. He couldn't even talk about what it was he did with his wife, which was frustrating to say the least. Albert nodded as he finished a healthy sampling of the coleslaw. "It can be," he responded. "I'm fortunate in that all of us siblings actually like each other, except during election years. Then we argue and fight like we did when we were little." Everyone snickered. "So which sibling is the one that leads that charge?" asked Jeff mischievously, before he took a bite of his baked beans. "My sister, of course," Albert answered. "You've met her, Jeff, I think. Gabi. During each election cycle, she works as a volunteer for the Florida Democratic Party. Man, is she piping mad about the president blasting the election results, saying the Chinese had intentionally interfered in the election to help his opponents." Albert put his fork down and grabbed for the last rib on his plate. A few of the guys laughed before Jeff responded. "It's not like he's wrong. I mean, the Chinese couldn't have been more obvious if they tried. They applied tariffs to nearly every business in 40-some congressional districts, all held by Republicans. I mean, if you're going to interfere in an election, at least try and be subtle about it." The guys nodded, and then the conversation casually shifted back away from politics. The rest of the evening went well, and they managed to avoid any major clashes. At the end, the guys all asked Seth for his secret to making those fall-off-the-bone ribs. Washington, D.C., Department of Homeland Security. Patricia Hogan, Patty to her friends, rubbed her temples as she took a seat at her desk, getting settled in to tackle the day's new challenges. She'd been the director of Homeland Security since the start of the Sachs administration, and while she loved her job, it was a real challenge. Trying to manage the more than 240,000 employees and dozens of agencies underneath her umbrella was an intense job. She thrived on it, though. Patty also reveled in the fact that she was only the second woman to have held the position. It thrilled her that, despite all the challenges of serving in the Sachs administration, she was excelling. She turned her mind back to the task at hand, shuffling through the paperwork on her desk, trying to prioritize what to work on first. It was now 12 days after the 2018 midterm elections, and her department was still trying to unravel exactly what had happened. Dozens of complaints had been filed to and by the Federal Election Commission about the sheer volume of misinformation, fake news, voter fraud allegations, and cyber attacks, not to mention the outright barrage of super PAC money with clear foreign ties benefiting both political parties. Each side demanded answers. Another folder on her desk dealt with the caravan of asylum seekers from Central America that was rapidly approaching the border. Then there was the full-blown trade war with China. It's been a rough week and a half, she realized. She took an Excedrin migraine, trying to get ahead of things before the stress caused yet another headache. She checked her schedule. It was 0800 hours, but her day would soon devolve into meetings that were scheduled almost back-to-back. She'd have to use her time wisely. She smiled as she remembered that one of her meetings today was about the blockchain voting pilot program, iVote, that had taken place during the most recent election in West Virginia. She was hopeful this could have a major impact on securing future elections. Patty rubbed her temples and collected her thoughts, mentally organizing her day. She hit the intercom button on the desk phone. "Jill, can you have some coffee brought in?" she asked. "Also, please tell Riku I want to talk with him before our 10 o'clock gets here, will you?" A few minutes later, her secretary popped in with a fresh pod of the extra-caffeinated Death Wish brand coffee, which she placed on a table near the corner of her office. "Riku said he'll be over momentarily," she announced before heading back to her desk in the anteroom. Patty smiled as she took a sip of her piping hot brain juice. "I just don't know what I'd do without Jill," she thought. Not only was her secretary an exceptional gatekeeper, but she played a pivotal role in keeping her on schedule and on track with her many deadlines. After only a minute, Riku Tanaka knocked on the doorframe of her office. "You needed me, boss?" he asked. Riku Tanaka was a first-generation Japanese-American from the San Francisco Bay Area, and by all accounts, he was a boy wonder. When Patricia had become the DHS secretary, she'd done the unthinkable in Washington and picked someone from outside the Beltway to become her lead technologist. Her overarching goal had been to do her best to modernize the agency and bring it into the 21st century. The organization had become a bloated bureaucracy that was running on outdated technology. This had made DHS inefficient, costly, and critically vulnerable to hacking. In order to streamline the organization and fix the critical vulnerabilities, she'd brought in someone who hadn't become ingrained in the lifestyle of Washington red tape. Riku had been a chief technology officer at a major Silicon Valley firm, with little to no political experience. When Patty had brought him on, she'd charged him with one overarching mission: modernize the agency with the newest, most secure technology available, and help her to make the agency more efficient and responsive to the needs of the country. At the deputy director level, Riku actually had the authority needed to force change across the organization. She waved him into her office, and the two of them took seats in the armchairs over to the side of the room. She offered him some coffee, but he just chuckled and said, "No thanks, that stuff's got a bit too much kick for me." She smiled. "Okay, Riku," she said with a laugh. "Hey, before we have our meeting with the Crossmatch folks, I wanted to get your thoughts on the West Virginia iVote program. How do you think it went?" He pulled a folder out of the leather messenger bag that he always carried around and handed her a printout. "It went great," he said, smiling. "Actually, better than great. The vendor provided each of the overseas service members a ring code that essentially acted as their unique voter ID and allowed them to securely cast their vote through the iVote app on their mobile device." "iVote. I like the ring of that," Patty said. "But I think you're going to need to explain this ring code thing to me again. How does it verify the person using it is actually a legal, authorized voter? She asked, placing the handout on the table between them. Sure thing, boss, Riku said with a nod. Patty was grateful that he was one of those rare individuals who was technologically brilliant and yet able to communicate complicated information in layman's terms. Basically, the individual submits their address and basic biographical information to the voter registration office. Once the individual is verified as an eligible voter, they are given an access code to use on the iVote application. The voter then inputs that access code, which allows them to create their unique identifier. Using their smartphone, their thumbprint is captured on the device. That biometric is then embedded with the ring code, and when the voter makes their selections on the ballot, that biometric and code is then added into the blockchain sequence and transmitted back to the voting office. Riku pulled out some other documents that had some pictures of the process on them as he walked her through the technical aspects of how the system worked. Patty fiddled with the bun in her hair. This sounds promising, she said. My only concern is how safe it is. Can it be manipulated? Well, I'm by no means a blockchain expert, but from what I gather, when the ring code is inserted into the chain, it is thoroughly embedded and encrypted, meaning if anyone tries to change that particular code in the chain, it'll show up as having been tampered with. Honestly, I think the more challenging part of implementing this program is going to come from the voter registration office. The voter rolls have to be up to date and verified. I'm more than a little worried about that particular piece of the puzzle being the area where we may see attempts at voter fraud, Riku replied. He uncapped his water bottle and took a couple of gulps. Furrowing her brow, Patty asked, What do you mean? How could voter fraud take place in that part of the process? Pretty easy, actually. If the voter rolls are in an online database, then they can be hacked. Also, if someone was able to breach the system, they could simply go in and change the voter rolls by dropping people from them or listing them as ineligible voters. By the time a voter realizes they are listed as ineligible or their name has been dropped from the rolls, it could be too late to have it appealed or looked into before they needed to cast their vote, and we both know that provisional ballots are often thrown out. She shook her head in dismay. Hackers will be the death of this country, she bemoaned to herself. Okay, Riku. I'd like you to write up a risk assessment concerning the voter rolls so we can present it at our meeting later. I want to close that loophole. Sure thing, boss, Riku said. He stood and left to get back to business. As he walked out, Patty smiled to herself. She knew she'd bucked the system when she'd hired Riku, but she didn't care. He often thought about angles many others ignored. She didn't care about his political leanings, as long as he stayed in his lane, and so far, he was genuinely doing a great job modernizing the Department of Homeland Security. Chapter 4. Unconventional Warfare. January 2019. Dalian, China. Dalian Shipbuilding Industry Company. Vice Admiral Hu Zhanshu stood silently on the bridge of the massive freighter, mesmerized as hundreds of workers swarmed over the center of the ship. The entire cargo hold had been removed and was being retrofitted with a series of vertical launch system pods. Once the conversion was complete, the cargo hold would carry 15 VLS pods, each pod containing 10 cruise missiles. The shipyard manager broke his trance. It was difficult in closing the construction cranes and the ship, but I believe we've sufficiently shielded our activities from the prying eyes of satellites and the casual observers outside the shipyard, he explained. Hu nodded. He had to admit, it was a clever idea to cover the ships being converted to mobile missile platforms. It did, however, limit the number of ships they could retrofit at one time, With the current schedule, they'd only have 12 of the ships ready when the time came. "What are we doing about the troop compartments?" Hu asked. "Those are on schedule as well," said the shipyard manager. "Right now we are converting shipping containers to act as bulk housing units for the soldiers. They aren't going to be the most comfortable living conditions, but they'll get our soldiers transported across the Pacific." Hu rubbed his neck, deep in thought. Several of the older military commanders had died recently. A few of the deaths had been deemed heart attacks, and one had been found with a pile of empty bottles of baijiu all around him, reeking of alcohol. One of Vice Admiral Hu's personal friends had been found hanging from a staircase by a noose. Hu was certain that his suicide had not been by choice. Someone was consolidating power. Hu hoped that what he was working on would be sufficient to keep him out of the crosshairs of whoever was culling the herd. Washington, D.C., Harry S. Truman Building. Secretary of State Haley Cagle shook her head in frustration as she read the latest cable from her ambassador at the UN, which explained that they were still going to move forward with their permanent UN peacekeeping force. "Well, good luck finding it, because we sure aren't," she thought. Gary Hamel, her Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs, poked his head into her office. "I see you're reading the cable from New York," he commented. He showed himself in and took a seat in the chair across from her desk. She frowned. "What are your thoughts on it, Gary?" He sighed. "I see the merits in such a resolution. I also know the optics of it won't sit well in America and a lot of other countries. The conspiracy folks are going to go nuts with it, and so will a handful of folks in Congress, I suspect." Haley bit her lower lip. "The president isn't going to support it," she asserted. "He already sees the UN as a parasitic leech, just sucking us dry of money while bashing us and our allies at every turn." Gary snickered. "The UN is what you make it. You know and I know that if you put more money in, you get more say in how it's run." "If that was the case, the UN would be doing our bidding instead of insulting us at every turn," Haley insisted. "We already contribute 15% of the UN budget." "And that's down from the 22% we used to contribute," Gary countered. "Nations like China, India, Saudi Arabia, Germany, and France have all stepped in to fill that financial void." "You sound like you want this new peacekeeping force," Haley retorted. Gary held up his hands in mock surrender. "Whoa, that's a big allegation to make," he replied with a big grin on his face. "All I'm saying is there have been a lot of problems with the peacekeeping force in the past. If creating a standing army and establishing rules, training, and procedures will help make them more efficient and let them handle peacekeeping operations better in the future, maybe the U.S. won't have to get involved nearly as much." Haley sighed. "I don't know. Maybe you're right. It could work. I seriously doubt the president is going to authorize any U.S. forces to participate in it, though. Once this official treaty with North Korea gets signed, he wants to do a rapid drawdown of forces over there and bring them back home." Gary nodded. "If the president is really able to secure this deal with North Korea, he should get the Nobel Peace Prize for it. But yeah, it makes sense to pull those troops back to the States." He leaned forward. "Honestly, my bigger concern is the series of base closures in Europe and the Middle East he's recommending to the Pentagon. We saw what happened when we pulled out of Iraq in 2011. If we pull out entirely from Europe and the Middle East, we'll leave a power vacuum that others will fill." "I've been cautioning him on that. I've gotten him to agree not to close Ramstein and to leave at least 2 of our facilities open in the UK. The rest of the German bases, though, are going to the brack on this next defense spending bill." Whenever a base went to the Base Realignment and Closure Board, it was very likely to get closed down. Then the powers that be would determine where those units would be relocated. "What about our bases in Italy and Spain? He's not recommending we close them, is he?" Haley crossed her arms. He's wanting to keep the Italian bases in Sicily, but he is going to close the other ones. As to Spain, yes, Rhoda will stay, though he's moving to sign a new deal with the UK to set up some new facilities in Gibraltar. So that could complicate things in Spain if he does. What the heck is he wanting to put in Gibraltar? Gary asked, left eyebrow crookedly raised. I was told it was going to be some sort of NSA facility and a repositioning of the SEAL teams that are currently stationed in Germany. They are also going to move more of the support functions from Naples to Gibraltar, Haley explained. He's really going to upset the apple cart in Europe, isn't he? It's been a long time coming, though, she said with a wry smile. I mean, he's not cutting ties with NATO, just shifting forces around. It does look like we're going to expand our footprint in Poland and Romania, if that makes you feel better. Gary tilted his head to the left. Okay, well, that's outside my purview, he said with a chuckle. So back to this UN force. From what I've been told, they're planning on hosting their first joint training exercise in October of 2020 to flesh out the details of how the force will work. In a way, they want to essentially create 2 combat brigades, one that will be in a training, dwell rest time, and one that will be deployed to various hotspots around the world. They're actually modeling it on how our force structure and the Canadian force structure work. Crinkling her brow, Haley asked, Where is this new army going to be based out of, and where are they going to host this exercise? I didn't see those details in the cable from New York. Okay, before you bite my head off, I'm just the messenger, Carey said, putting his right hand over his heart. Canada has offered their military facilities to be used by this new UN force, and the exercise is slated to take place in Ontario and Vancouver. Haley's mouth dropped open in surprise. What? She managed to gasp. Don't they know how this will affect NATO and our various joint facilities? We can't have Chinese, or worse, Russian, peacekeepers roaming around on Canadian facilities that are also tied into our own early warning system. Hey, I'm just bringing you the facts, Gary insisted. It's that new Canadian Prime Minister. He's a real globalist. Petulant boa king, Haley retorted. He talks a big globalist game because he knows he doesn't have to implement half of that crap, because Sachs keeps him from doing it. Gary sighed. My suggestion, Madam Secretary, is that you convince the President to at least contribute a token military element to be a part of this new UN force, even if they're just planners or something. This way we can keep tabs on their activity and have some observers report back to us on what they're seeing. It's better than being frozen out of it entirely. Haley nodded. She had to agree with the logic. Hopefully I'll be able to get the President and the Secretary of Defense to see the same thing, she thought. Washington, D.C., U.S. Supreme Court Building. Anna Cho poured coffee for Chief Justice Mark Lighthouse, who graciously smiled and accepted the piping hot java.
Thank you, Anna. I must say I love this new brand of coffee you've found. What is the name of it again?
She smiled. It's that Hawaiian Kona coffee. You know, the one Justice Keaton was raving about. She asked me to order some for you guys. Something about how it would make you more agreeable with her positions. She replied with a wink. Then she moved to fill the next justice's cup. Justice Lighthouse nodded.
Oh, yes. Barbara is quite the coffee connoisseur, isn't she?
He said, as if suddenly remembering a key detail.
It's not my Jamaican blue, but it's pretty darn close,
he replied. He lifted the coffee to his lips and took in a deep breath of the aromatic blend before taking his first sip.
That might actually be better than my Jamaican blend,
he admitted quietly. Of course it's better than Jamaican blue, retorted Justice Barbara Keaton. This stuff is grown in the soil of volcanic ash, giving it deep nutrients and minerals from within the bowels of the earth. Her comment elicited a few laughs from the other justices as they prepared themselves to hunker down in their deliberation room to hash over a decision on a particularly thorny case they'd heard at the start of their fall session.
"If you could, Anna, close the door on your way out. We'll page you if we need another pot brought in,"
Chief Justice Lighthouse said as he raised his coffee mug toward her in a sort of cheers motion. He turned back to face his colleagues.
"Well, I suppose we should get back to it," he announced.
Returning to the kitchen, Anna went ahead and prepared another pot of coffee, knowing all too well that they would be ringing her for a refill within another 30 minutes. The justices were, if nothing else, predictable in what they liked to eat and drink when in deliberation. While Anna was getting the coffee ready, her cell phone buzzed, letting her know she had received a message. She pulled it out of her pocket and saw the image of her and her parents when they'd visited Beijing a couple of years ago. She smiled, but felt a twinge of sadness. While her parents had immigrated to America when she was just a young child, many of her relatives still lived in China. She wished she could visit them more often. "Are you still going to Niagara next month?" asked one of her co-workers. She nodded. "I still can't get over the fact that you're going to Canada in the winter on purpose," he said jokingly. "I know. My boyfriend wasn't so easily convinced, but the photography opportunities for me will just be unbelievable," Anna explained. "Just wait until I come back with amazing shots of frozen, swirling ice sculptures." She was really looking forward to having this adventure and spending time alone with her boyfriend, too. "I still think you're crazy," her coworker retorted with a chuckle. 2 weeks later, Anna and her boyfriend were enjoying themselves at the Casino Niagara after a full day of touring the falls and snapping endless photos. The cold temperatures had created beautiful formations of ice that looked like they had been designed by glassblowers. The light refracted off different parts of the structures, releasing beautiful blues and greens. At times, it was like walking through a castle of ice crystals made by Jack Frost himself. It was truly beautiful. When Anna had taken enough pictures to feel like she had made the trip worthwhile, she suggested to her boyfriend that they check out the all-you-can-eat buffet at the casino in town and have some fun gambling at some of the tables. Throughout the evening, the two of them tried their luck at blackjack, craps, and a few slot machines. Anna had just hit the bonus games at one slot machine, and she felt a rush as the bright-colored lights flashed on the screen. She'd been down until then, and she felt the adrenaline course through her as she suddenly hoped to win big. Suddenly, a man sat down next to her. Without looking at her, he placed a small L'Oreal lipstick tube on a ledge right between their two machines. Anna saw it and gave the man a slight nod of acknowledgement just as he got up and left. Then she opened her clutch like she was looking for something, and without a second thought, she reached down and grabbed the lipstick tube and quickly placed it inside. She waited until the machine stopped tabulating her wins, and then she cashed out her money on the slot machine and moved over to a nearby bar. Getting the bartender's attention, she ordered a martini. While the bartender was fixing her drink, another man walked up to her, a drink already in his hand.
"When the time comes, all you have to do is pour it into their drinks, and it'll do the rest,"
he said casually, quietly, and without making eye contact. "How will I know when I'm supposed to do it?" she asked.
"Someone will reach out to you. For right now, find a safe and discreet place to hide it. When you're told to act, you'll have 48 hours to follow through."
With that, the man stood up straight and walked over to the craps table he had passed up just a few moments earlier. "Here you go, ma'am. That'll be $8, the bartender said as he handed her the martini, oblivious to the conversation she'd just had. Smiling, Anna pulled a 10 out from her clutch and handed it to him. "Thank you so much. Please keep the change." She grabbed her drink and went to go join her boyfriend, who was somehow killing it at the blackjack tables. Then again, he was a bit of a savant when it came to numbers. Maybe that was why she'd latched on to him. He was a brilliant programmer at the NSA, though she had yet to determine exactly what he did there. The rest of their trip went by uneventfully, though she believed her boyfriend was starting to develop a real attachment to her. A few more months, and I'll have him spilling his guts to me on what he does at work, she thought mischievously. New York, New York, United Nations Headquarters. Johann Baer was elated. Not only was he the new Secretary General of the UN, but in his first 6 months, he'd managed to get a resolution for a new, permanent UN peacekeeping force passed. Albeit the Americans vetoed his first attempt, but he eventually got it passed in the General Assembly and put it into effect. The Prime Minister of Canada, Félix Gagnon, had even volunteered Canada to host the newly created force and offer their military bases and facilities to help train and mentor it. Things couldn't be going better for Johann. Now, he just needed to rally the rest of his supporters to identify who could replace Sachs and steer the American government back into the UN fold. A knock at the door brought him back to the current moment. Looking up, he saw an old familiar face and waved for his friend to come in. "Lance, it's good to see you again," Johann said. He moved around his desk to shake hands with Lance Solomon, the new head of Goldman Sachs. Johann and Lance had been friends for decades. While Johann was not a member of the secretive Skull and Bone Society like Lance was, he knew his friend represented not just the super wealthy and powerful within America, but also the secret organization itself. When Lance called for an appointment, Johann knew better than to make the man wait. "Johann, it's good to see you as well, my friend," Lance said warmly. "I'm so glad you are taking charge here at the UN. We've needed a strong man in this position for some time." Smiling at the compliment, Johann replied, "I agree. I'm just glad we were able to make it finally happen." Now that this resolution to create a permanent peacekeeping force is in place, it's time we moved forward with some of the other pieces to this grand strategy, don't you think? Lance asked cryptically. "I agree," Johann responded. He walked back around his desk and pulled a small electronic device out of a drawer, showing it briefly to Lance before he switched it on and placed it on the coffee table. "I want to make sure this conversation stays private, so I've brought out the trusty electronic jamming device," Johann explained. "You can't be too careful these days." Lance nodded but didn't say anything. He actually looked a bit calmer with the device running. Johann cleared his throat. "I believe we now have a field of candidates starting to form to replace President Sachs. Do you have a particular person in mind?" he asked, waiting to see who Skull and Bones would be backing. "We do," Lance said with a smile. "I'm sure you've heard of him. He's actually one of your strongest supporters in the U.S. Senate." "Marshall Tate?" "Yes. He's been selected by the Society to be our next president," Lance said matter-of-factly. Johann's forehead scrunched up a bit. "I would have thought you guys would have backed the woman senator from California, or the governor of New York." "Marshall's a Skull and Bones. The others are not. It's time we put one of our own back into the office again. We need to get the world's trade policies back on track. This current America alone policy is wreaking havoc on things, and it has to be corrected." "You know, some of the others had a different candidate in mind, Lance," Johann said. Smiling, Lance responded, "I'm sure the others do have a different name in mind, but the others don't understand American politics like we do. They also don't know which candidate will be able to obtain the popular support needed to pull this off. Marshall isn't just a member of Skull and Bones. He's also been a mayor of a working-class city and a congressman of a working-class district before he became a senator. He'll resonate with the type of voter we're going to need to win over if our Chinese friends fail on their end." Johann bristled a bit. "Pang will not fail," he insisted. "I have it on good authority that his network is already in place. and he's already identified exactly how they're going to tilt things in favor of whoever the nominee is. Peng's people had better not get caught. If they do, it could jeopardize everything, Lance stated in an icy tone that indicated he might hold Johann responsible if things went south. He won't get caught. We've already found our patsies, Johann declared with confidence. Now it was Lance's turn to lift an eyebrow. Do tell, he said coyly. Johann shook his head as he smiled. The less you know, Lance, the less you can be held culpable for. Lance nodded and winked. What are your plans if things don't work out with this UN peacekeeping force, or we meet a greater level of resistance than we planned for? Asked Johann in a nervous tone. This was his biggest concern with the plan. He knew that despite political support and a formal request for assistance, his peacekeeping force would be viewed as invaders and meet heavy resistance from a very well-armed populace. Waving the concern off, Lance responded, We have that planned for. We'll be bringing in private military contractors from other parts of the world when and if they are needed. We've already been talking with a few of the major PMCs about what-if scenarios. Funds are being set aside, so when the time comes, the money will be ready. You just need to focus on getting as large of a contingent on Canadian soil as possible. See if Peng can convince his masters in Beijing to pony up a larger force. Johann nodded and jotted down a quick note. Agreed, he said. He took a deep breath. I'm still concerned about the U.S. military. What if they side with Sachs when the time comes? How do we deal with that? Let us deal with that end of things, Lance insisted. We have contingency plans in place for that as well. The two of them talked for a bit longer, going over some additional details before Lance Solomon left to head back to his own office at Goldman's, just down the street. They would be working together a lot over the next year, so Lance planned on being close to the UN headquarters for a while.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.